For the newly indoctrinated, Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files follows the story of a professional wizard in Chicago. The first book, Stormfront, was published in 2000, and the series now boasts 17 novels, plus a combined 36 short stories, comics, and graphic novels to help flesh out the world. On top of that, The Dresden Files has also produced a television series, card games, and a TTRPG. With all that content, and a ballpark estimate of 6 coming novels, we've started our podcast as a way to break down the series' most important moments, characters, and lore. Add theories, ramblings, and outside sources, and you've got the #1 Dresden podcast for all your interests. This is McAnally's Dresden Files Pubcast by Free Flow Rambling. Conjure by it at your own risk. Welcome to the first episode of our podcast, McAnally's Pubcast. Brought to you by Free Flow Rambling. We started our podcast as a way to discuss the series, talk about characters and theories, of course, general ramblings. Our podcast episode will be split up between 2 sections, a general spoiler-free discussion, and then a second episode that will enter the spoiler zone. We will discuss the text in question of terms of the larger universe under the pretense that everyone listening consents to hearing theories, spoilers, and details they may not otherwise be privy to. To introduce ourselves, my name is Tansenn. I am one of the hosts, the producer and interim director. I am an IT manager by day and a musician by night. I was first introduced to the Dresden Files by Maggie approximately 7 years ago, and have recently been doing my first reread.
I'm Maggie. I found the Dresden Files by way of Jim Butcher himself, by way of James Marsters. I was a mod on Marsters' message board, and Butcher popped on to proclaim his love for Buffy and Spike, and then he was all like, hey, so I wrote a couple books, James is doing the audiobooks, like, come check it out. And then I did. And it was good. And I found yet another Harry in my life to adore and obsess over. I think there's like 3 or 4 of them now. And now we're here.
My name is Jess. I've been around Dresden since my mother Maggie got obsessed in the early 2000s.
Guilty.
I like to talk, and I'll be running social media mostly because I'm obsessed with my phone.
Fair.
Now with our introductions out of the way, let's begin our discussions with the first book in the series, Stormfront.
Harry Dresden is the best at what he does. Well, technically, he's the only at what he does. So when the Chicago PD has a case that transcends mortal creativity or capability, they come to him for answers. For the everyday world is actually full of strange and magical things, and most of them don't play well with humans. That's where Harry comes in. Takes a wizard to catch whatever. There's just one problem. Business, to put it mildly, stinks. So when the police bring him in to consult on a grisly double murder committed with black magic, Harry's seeing dollar signs. But where there's black magic, there's a black mage behind it. And now that mage knows Harry's name. And that's when things start to get interesting. Magic. It can get a guy killed.
Let's talk about the audiobook for this first novel first. I understand that James Marsters didn't really have a lot of opportunity to do a read-through before he did his actual recording.
Yeah, something about that. Yeah, he hadn't sort of had time to like prep and go over it. So it basically was a cold read, that first recording. He sort of didn't know how the story went. And so there was a couple of bits where, yeah, just as he was sort of reading it, sort of, and it was a little bit, and I mean, yes, I admit, if I'd only ever come to it as that, I might have been a little bit like, But I like James Marsters, so I was willing to sort of give him the benefit of the doubt. And there's some parts that he reads that are just absolutely fantastic. And then when I did get my hands on a copy of the book to do sort of like the actual, I could sort of see like, okay, yeah, that's where he sort of tripped over his words a little bit. Or, you know, it was probably like got to the end of the you know, like the margin of the page, but the sentence didn't quite end there, you know, and it was like that. But yeah, you do have to give a little bit of a grain of salt or whatever with that first audiobook. So Jim Butcher's writing in general, as he develops his characters and his plots and his world, it smooths out a little bit. It gets better. There are a couple of little bit rough patches in the first one, but I find them pretty negligible. And I find the overall character of Harry and his snark and sarcasm and humor and that appealing enough to sort of ride you over those first bits. And same thing with James Marsters' readings. I was like, yeah, there's a little bit rough in the first, like 1 or 2 kind of a thing. And then after that, things, and you can tell like James, he sort of said as much, but it seems like he gets more into the series, right? So he's more excited about reading, and it's not just like, oh, I have to do this. I agreed, this is my job, but it's kind of like he's like, no, these are like good stories. I like reading them. It's enjoyable, right?
Well, even him at his worst would still be way better than some of the other readings for audiobooks that are out there. Like, what a stroke of luck to get him as the narrator.
Yeah, right. And that's the thing. I think that's one of the advantages I like with like an actor and stuff like that too. And I found that with other, like, there's a few audiobooks, sometimes you have just the straight up narrators, and depending on the type of story, that's kind of okay too, because that kind of harkens back to my like childhood and schooling and way you were sort of taught to read and read out loud, and like masterpiece theater. There's kind of a quality and tone to just sort of like a narration, and sometimes that's fine, but sometimes
almost a film noir.
But he sort of does. Like, I like that he very much fleshes out the different like voices and personalities of the characters and stuff like that, right? And it becomes easier to tell who's who just by talking without necessarily having this person said, that person said this, right? It's like you can tell because he switches the voices up and the things, and you're like, oh, I know who's talking, kind of a stuff, and it makes it more fun. It gives the characters more personality. And
professional actor that is doing the work.
Yeah, and thankfully Marsters is pretty decent at, as evidenced on Buffy, because for a very long time, a very large amount of people all thought that he was British, and they were all very surprised to find out that he was a little Modesto, California boy. And they're like, what? He's not really like... So he's pretty good. He can do some different voices and some different accents and some different things like that, which, helps sort of to bring it more alive and make it more enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. I find the setting of this book is... we'll talk a little bit about how the acceptance of magic in Chicago at the time, because it does sort of talk about in those first few chapters about how it isn't set in a modern day 2000 Chicago, and has a bit of a disappointment with science and politics, and has been ready to accept
that the world's view of the new religion is science. And that's been kind of disappointing because it hasn't fully explained everything and made everything happen. And I think honestly the way, and I think you brought this up before, kind of a thing, and I honestly look at this, the way I read it is very much exactly how the world climate is regarding this. It's really not a wide public thing. Like, we all enjoy our vampires and our werewolves and our Marvel movies and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, none of us really, really believe it's real, right? And there's, everybody has maybe, or the majority of people, you have a little bit of there might be good, like, even for myself, right? I'm like, I don't know that I've ever really had like an absolute for sure, oh yeah, fuck, there was a ghost in the room. But I've also had like some weird shit. You get that creeping up your spine, your hair standing on end, some millions and millions of weird shit reported out there that you're kind of like, well,
the possibility,
like, there might be something to something. I don't know, and whether it's like, part of that person that's left behind, or just a vague imprint that isn't really connected to them, whether it's spiritual and religious, whether it's trauma, like, I don't really know. I don't go into it that way, but it's kind of like, I very much read it that exactly the world is that there are people out there who swear up and down they've had some kind of experience with something. But yeah, so there are, your Wiccans and things who have their level of beliefs and what that means. There are your everyday Joe Schmo. There are your absolute believers. There's your whack jobs. There's your non-believers. There's your religious, right? Like, is very much like that. Like, basically how the world views it in real life is sort of how it's presented in Dresden to begin with, right? So he's like, no shit, I'm for real. I'm like, actually, and most of us are like, yeah, okay, sure, yeah.
Fortunately, they're just enough to actually hire an open wizard to do these investigations, although they sort of covertly put it under as a a psychic, which is still believing in paranormal, but not
To a certain
to the-
extent, we're willing to believe that a psychic might have a feeling that we're willing to look into, but we're not actually going to believe that you're a magic practitioner who.
Yeah, and
knows
exactly
that.
right. Like that has become a thing in the world today. Is there are psychic consultants, right? Sometimes that has led to I don't want to say profitable results, successful, clues and whatever and results, insights and things like that. Yeah, so it's
otherworldly insights.
Yeah, and again, whether, like I have to laugh, like I'm currently rewatching Psych right now, which is more of a same as The Mentalist, which they make fun of because Psych came out first and then The Mentalist. So Psych was more comedic, The Mentalist was more drama. But it's basically, about a fake psychic, that they just base so much on like observations and picking up things around them and stuff like that, So it's like, right, exactly. You're like, well, is there really such a thing? Are the psychics really getting the vibes? But it doesn't really, and especially in the context of these shows and stuff like that, it doesn't really matter. It's just the end results are, is it moving things along? Do they get somewhere in the end? Do they catch, right? So yeah, same thing.
Yeah, that's a fair thing with Dresden, too, though, is that a lot of the time it's not the magic that helps him, it's just being smart enough to take in all the information So a lot of his information is coming from demons or angels or wizards or fairies.
Third eye.
But either way.
Yeah, whether
either
that's
way,
your
he's more
snitch on the
just-
corner.
Same as the way, in Psych, it's really just putting the puzzle pieces together until you've got the answer rather than just constant spell casting and...
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely, and that is it. And Dresden does come. Dresden has apprenticed as a private investigator under sort of a regular, average, ordinary private investigator. So he's got his PI license and he's done his footwork. He just adds the element that dude's also a wizard and he can track things.
Wonderful
different ways.
juxtaposition to allow a regular reader, especially somebody who's done mysteries, to enter sort of a fantasies, or vice versa, somebody who wants to read more mystery. This is a perfect bridge over piece because it touches on two different genres.
Yes, yeah, and it sort of encompasses them both fairly equally, I think.
And the all-encompassing comedy genre.
Oh my god, yeah, and I have to admit that's one of the biggest things I love. Like like we were mentioning before, there has been a few years now. Usually, Butcher was averaging it was like around a year and a half. So for the most part, you would sort of get it coming out at the same time, and then it might be like a couple extra months, and then this last one, which admittedly there was a lot more going on. He's got other projects that hopefully we will eventually get to and work on some of his other stuff as well. But he's got different series and stuff he was working on, different personal life things happening, and just developing these last couple of books took a bit more. So we have this huge weight. So trying to fill that void and trying to find other things. And so I was trying to sometimes do that. Books like Dresden, like if you like this, you might like, right? And some of the stuff, and I have to admit there was a couple of times like I think one for sure, I never made it past the first chapter and stuff like that. And a few others where it was just, but yeah, things I've read, and when the characters have to explain themselves too much or point out, like, oh, I'm so sarcastic, like nobody gets me, but I'm just sarcastic, or, everybody just thinks I'm kind of bitchy, but really I'm just sarcastic. I'm like, no, if you have to keep bringing it up and putting it out there, you're really not. Like, I'm just like, no. And I like that. Like, Dresden will kind of, he'll mention, he's got like snark, or he's got to always have like a comeback. He just can't keep his mouth shut. But he doesn't harp on, he doesn't spend like an entire chapter being like, I'm so sarcastic and people just don't get me. They think I'm an ass. I'm like, no, he just does it. He just does or says something funny or snarky or sarcastic.
Sarcastic by example.
Exactly. It was like, methinks you protest too much kind of a deal, right? I'm sorry, I screwed that all up for anybody that's going to be annoyed by actually getting quotes right. But yeah, it's like, just do it and say, you don't need to have to keep explaining it all the time, because it means you really not if you have to point it out. If nobody gets it, that's because you're doing it wrong. If you're doing it right, we get it. Less said, the better. Just, yeah. And his is very much, I love like his reference humor to like pop culture and things like that. And just, the kind of snark and sarcasm. And that is, I absolutely adore that kind of writing. I adore that kind of character. And Butcher does it really well. Harry does it really well. And, It's fantastic. Plus, you get the mystery.
All right. Well, that concludes our quick talk about the book itself and our first little bit of an introduction to ourselves. Next, we are going to talk to you about Chapter 1. This is our episode, Harry, You're a Wizard.
Alrighty, so here we start off the first chapter of the first book with an introduction to the titular character, Mr. Harry Dresden himself. We meet Harry in his office building, killing time with no current cases. He soon receives a call from a nervous woman looking for her missing husband. Dresden's not sure if this is the type of situation he can help with, but makes an appointment to discuss the details further in person. On the heels of that call, he receives another from the Chicago PD Special Investigations Division. Harry has done some work for them in the past, but this time it's a little weightier with a double murder having been committed. So does anybody remember their initial reaction, their first thoughts to the introduction of It's Been So Long for Me that I honestly don't necessarily remember my sort of first...
Yeah, the first thing that I remember thinking is I wondered how old he was, because he seems like such a crotchety...
Old.
I guess he's probably about 30 or 40 because he's just,
Yeah.
scowling at a lot of things.
You would be wrong. It's not ever really mentioned in the books, but it would be outside information you need to have. But it is established by Jim Butcher that he's in and about 25 years old at the start of the series.
Where does that information reside?
Well, it's a little bit of a fan base timeline that they've come up with to figure out, based on the things that Harry says was happening in his youth and based on moments that have happened in the stars and planets and worldwide cultural phenomenon that was happening and has been referenced.
He watched Dukes of Hazzard at a formative age.
Basically speaking, fans have been able to nail down that he's roughly 25, and Jim Butcher himself in his Word of Jim, aka any interview he's ever given, is all compiled under Word of Jim.
And for those of you who are listening, we do have on our website a page that's resources that leads to this website, and those who are also familiar with Jim Butcher's website, he does have community resources as well that does have this timeline.
The fan-compiled timeline, exactly.
Fan-compiled, author-approved.
Exactly. So all of that combined leads us to know that Harry is more or less 25. There is occasionally conflicting information that drags his age, give or take a year or two.
Yeah,
but more or less, he's about 25
We'll
at the
just
start
go with
of the series.
25. Okay, good.
In Stormfront anyways.
Well,
Yeah.
and this is our first really clear, in this book, our clear introduction to our main character, which is Harry. My impression of him was that he's quite honest to a fault. He gives the hard truth to his clients, whether it costs him money or not. He has a very specific view on it, what it means to be a wizard, which I think is probably also why I thought he was older.
Harry has very hard opinions about everything, and he sticks to those morals, again, as you said, to a fault sometimes.
For the most, yeah, exactly. He's got sort of some very specific rules and regulations, and some of them are externally imposed. That's the word I was looking for. Some of them are externally imposed, and some of them are internally his own sort of rules and guides that his own personal code of honor, and that he goes by.
One of those code of honors being a chivalrous code of honor. Pardon me.
Codes of honor.
Yeah, so as you see later in the books, Harry, when confronted with the female presence, can sometimes turn that little bit extra chauvinistic or over-the-top gentleman, sort of a little outdated. Chivalry.
The shining knight in
Exactly, so...
Now,
armor.
this was not something that ever particularly bothered me. Like, I had comparatively older parents. I had a large family where I fall into it. I've got older siblings, younger siblings. There was 30 years of raising children kind of a thing. So my parents we're a little bit older in that sense. So now I don't know if that's a little bit sort of those older traditions and values that I'm just like, well, my dad was a gentleman. My dad was a very sweet guy. Like, or if, I'm just sort of oblivious. But I find some people get very offended. They think Harry is really chauvinistic and like really misogynistic and really, and I don't. I find that, to me, I guess I can see how it can kind of be viewed that way, but I find sort of like the sweeter, more genteel aspects of it. I don't find that he looks down on women per se. I don't find that he automatically finds them incapable, but he was raised to treat a lady, like you pull out a chair and you open a door, and not that belittles them in a way. To him, that's just polite and nice, like he says it himself, I think we should treat women as something other than like shorter, weaker men, right? So and listening to some other things, I found some other good podcasts out, not as good as this one, sorry, but that I've been listening, and again, they're sort of like very like, oh, it's always described as, like it's always commenting on all the women and their descriptions and their blah 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 blah, and I'm like, maybe I just kind of missed that the first time around, maybe I just wasn't, What do you, Tansenn? Do you have a...
Well, I was thinking that because the author actually comes back to this, and I'm not sure if it's just more than chapter 1, but he does say that he's almost to a fault chivalrous, and that it's almost to his detriment.
Yeah.
That he has a weakness for a damsel in distress, quote unquote.
Yes.
Quote unquote, not...
Yeah.
And I think that this is more of a character development thing that shows that he's willing to do anything for somebody who needs the help, less so much their gender is. I think that it has actually more to do with that he wants to go out there and help somebody who cannot help themselves.
Right, Jess?
Well, I think, like, to a point, Jim Butcher has also just been criticized as sometimes focusing on the female too much. Sometimes his descriptions are just...
Yeah, the male gaze,
like,
right? Like, do you find that? Do you see that when you read it?
Every character needs his flaws. So, to a point, if it's not this, it's going to be something else, and it's not something that I think that Harry is drawing out for too long. It's a comment here, and then you're moving on with the story, so it's not something that I'm generally sitting there fuming, like, can we just move on already? I get it, like, move on. Like, for the most part, whatever he says his piece, and we're going past that. It is something that I know people are upset with, just even Butcher himself. Just, again, the male gaze, like, you don't need to focus on this. You don't need to comment on that. Like, she folded her arms under her breasts. Like, yeah, that's where you fold arms. You don't need to, exactly specify.
Well, and we're looking at this right now from a perspective that's got 20 years because it came out in 2000, which is not something that maybe at the very time would have been picked apart as much as it would have been now.
And I think that in maybe a little bit, because even still, I think going into 2000s, there was still a lot more, like you say, maybe a little bit more. But I guess for me, part of, like you said, I like what you say sort of about the flaws. You're right, Harry does have some flaws, and that is part of what, he's not just like this demigod, like, ooh, I can do magic, I know everything, I can do everything, I can pull everything out of my butt and just, right, he runs into obstacles and flaws. And I guess for me, it's that you're right, Harry might be a little bit that way, and that is, like you say, part of his flaws, part of his characters, part of the way Butcher has sort of been like, hey. But I guess the difference for me, why I don't focus on it as much, is because the women aren't. Like I say, we are getting all of this from Harry's perspective. We're inside Harry's head, Harry first person. So there's that.
Unreliable narrator.
But there's the women aren't, right? Like, I think that Butcher does a good job, and we're going to get into more of the characters right away, right? But I'm like Murphy, who we meet, well, she phones. We get her very briefly at the end of this chapter when we get more on her, right? But she's not a particularly weak, incapable person, and there are other women that come and go in Harry's life that, again, I think, they're not all just pin-up bimbos kind of a thing, right? So I guess Harry's doesn't bother me that way because Butcher brings the strong female into the story. Yeah,
exactly. So it's a little bit like, sure, to a point, even when Harry says, like, oh, just, like, sit at home and be safe, he's not actually acting on it. Like, sometimes he may make the, like, well, this is going to be dangerous. Well, you don't really know what you're signing up for. Well, maybe it's best if you say here. Like, he certainly said and done the piece, but generally speaking, when the women around him have stepped up and said, you're not keeping me out of the fight, Harry generally is like, all right, cool, like, grab a gun, let's go, you know? Like, it's not to the point where, as you read in other books, where they're very much like, you're staying at home and I'm going to deal with this and I'll see you later. It's like a lot more of like the very like...
Yeah, he's like, yeah, you know, I care about... But I mean, yeah, he'll do that for a lot of other people too. And you're right, maybe slightly more female-centric. But I mean, again, I think that's that gut reaction of, you know, protect the women and children kind of a thing in Harry's life. And the men are a little bit more expendable kind of a thing, right? But you're right, he certainly... I mean, there's more than enough times where he goes to women for help, whether it's ideas, knowledge, information, or sometimes straight up
ass kicking
and stuff like that, you know, and exactly. And I think, and again, I get that, right? Like, if I want to internalize that and be like, yeah, you know, if this was my partner or my kids or you know, I would be like, yeah, you know what, can you not, you know, like, and I mean, you do that, like, as a parent and stuff like that, right? There's plenty of things where you're like, I'm not going to think about my kid getting on a city bus and going to school because it's going to freak me out if I start thinking about the 10 million things that can go wrong. But my kids are going to fucking kill me if I'm like, you're not allowed to ride the city bus. Like, you know what I mean? You can't go anywhere. You can't get anywhere else. I'm not available to drive you, but I'm not letting you on, you know what I mean? Or, you know, learning to drive, you know, it's like, you don't want to think about the first time they're going to be on icy, snowy roads. You don't want to think about the first time a drunk driver, like, goes zipping past them on a, you know, like, you just... Right, same thing. I'm like, we would love to box our families up and keep them safe, but we know it's not practical, right? So I kind of look at it more like that. Like I'd really rather you stay here and didn't get involved because there's a good chance this could end badly for you. But when they're like, not going to happen, he's like, okay, fine. Here's how best we can defend ourselves going in.
Yeah, so it's like, again, I can understand why some people might just not agree with that. When they read it, they might be a little bit like turned off or put their noses up at it, but I honestly don't think that it's, in cases like that, I think it's people who are looking for a problem with it, because it's really not something that for me takes up enough of the text to be important enough, you know? It's
okay. That's good. Yeah, that was for me. I just kind of wanted to confirm that because, yeah, I mean, again, since we are women with that women perspective, I'm like, it never really bothered me. Am I just not being sensitive enough, or are other people being too sensitive? But okay, it's other people are just those that want to focus on it will focus on it and be bothered.
Exactly. So I'll see him as more of a protector, sort of, is what I sort of end up seeing him as.
Maybe full of himself, you know, but
he might, but yeah, with good intentions.
He's got that 25-year-old arrogance that most men that have at that age. Not that I'm a 25-year-old male to have
or
that
ever
perspective.
Not anymore.
Sorry, guys. But I guess, you know, youth, male, testosterone. Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
I'll cut that out later, I'm sure.
But yeah, I like how he's like sitting there reading books, like his paper. Like, that's the other thing I like, right? Like, Harry's kind of like a nerd like us.
He's well read.
Right. He's well read. He's got his box of paperback novels that he's flipping through and stuff like that, right?
And yeah, so it's been established we've got this, you know, mid-20s-year-old guy is a wizard sitting in his office
struggling a bit. Yeah, this is his business. He's hung out a shingle, but doesn't always pay well. He's not super well established yet.
So
and then he gets a phone call from a mystery woman.
And I kind of love, this is another thing that I just kind of love, like, he's sitting there, like, so he gets annoyed at the mailman bringing him, like, the registered mail, because that's just not going to be good. And then the mailman's like, what, are you kidding? And he's like, fuck no, like, I'm actually a wizard, like it says, like, just leave me alone, right? Kind of not in the mood for, right? And then, so yeah, kind of bemoaning the fact that he's got bills to pay. This registered mail that he didn't want is like another late notice from his landlord and stuff like that, right? And then the phone rings and he's like, what the fuck? Right? Like, he's kind of like suspicious, right? He's like, why is that? And he doesn't want to look... Right? He's like, I'm just going to let it ring a few times because I don't want it to look like I'm desperate for, right? So part of him, he's kind of like, why are you ringing? And then he's like, well, wait, I really do need a case. This is good, but I'm not going to like pick up right away because I don't want them to think that I'm like sitting around here waiting for, right? Like, again, I just kind of like how that all sort of sets him up and like sort of his, you know, sort of personality and character that way, right? That he's just like, I'm desperate, but I'm trying not going to make it obvious that I'm desperate.
real cool.
Real cool. know, just, hi, this is Dresden.
Does it ever say what his registered mail was? Out of
Yes, it was another late notice from his landlord.
Ah, okay.
That's what it is. Yeah, when he finally gets it and looks at it, that's what it is. It's
admit I
another.
missed that.
So whether, I'm not sure, I'm going to assume from his office landlord, which is where he's at, not like his home landlord, because I wouldn't imagine they need to send him registered mail. I imagine she'd just...
He's not in the same building, is he?
His landlord,
His
yes.
office?
His
No, his office
in
is
the
not.
downtown.
He's got a legit office in a legit office building in like mid-downtown Chicago, and then he has a house, which we'll get to in a bit, but I don't think this is a major spoiler. He rents a room in a boarding house, but his landlady also lives in his boarding house.
Oh, I'm so glad you guys are the experts because I don't always pay attention to this.
Yeah, so so again, I'm assuming this is I'm assuming his landlady would just be like, "Yo, Harry, your rent's late again." But he seems to have a little bit of a relationship with his landlady. So, but this, I'm assuming, if it's registered mail, I'm assuming that this is the rent for his office building. That they're like, Mr. Wizard.
Again, setting up that he hasn't necessarily got a lot of income.
Yeah.
Especially all of the-
He's struggling. He's starting out. He's right. So this is what he wants to do. He wants to be a wizard. He doesn't want to,
Disbelief.
be on the down low like most of the supernatural community, right? Like, this is why we don't really believe, because we don't actually see werewolves and stuff, right? So he's like kind of flying in the face of tradition by practicing his art openly.
Puts his ad in the yellow pages.
Puts his ad,
as
is
wizard.
the only one, and so everyone's kind of like, what the fuck, right? And so so like the mailman, a lot of people think he must be like a stage alert. And this is the other thing this is where we introduce Harry for fully who he is. Harry Blackstone Copperfield Dresden. Yeah, so Harry, PI, phone book. So so he gets this call, so his phone finally goes off. And we've got this sort of nervous, timid woman looking for her husband. And this is one of the other things that's kind of a little bit funny. And again, I don't know if this is just me or if this is one of those things where it's a little bit of a glitch in the writing that kind of smooths out later. But Harry's all like, because she's like, well, my husband's missing. And he's like, well, have you tried the police or like a PI? And she's like, well, I don't think. And he's like, well, I'm not sure this is really my thing. So she's like, okay, well, sorry to bother you. And then he's like, well, no, wait. And I'm like, you just told her you couldn't help her, though. Like, to me, that was always something that kind of, and I'm like, I guess he's sort of, partially it's he's looking for the money and stuff like that. But it's just, it was just one of those things that just read to me a little bit funny at the time, where basically he's like, yeah, I don't think I can help you with this. So she's like, okay. And then he's like, well, wait, don't hang up. It's like, but you just said you can't help me.
What do you think, Jess? Is that on purpose or
is that just a me thing?
I mean, I think it's just a little bit of the writing, the way it was put,
just
and
a little
also
bit of
just human
the-
error. Like,
Yeah.
man, this doesn't have to do. Wait. Look at your bills again. Be reminded of the fact that, because again, Harry has that moral code where he's like, I'll turn away business if I don't think I'm the right person for the job. I want them to actually get the help that they need.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's a little bit like, well, I can do it. Like,
I could maybe, yeah.
And I wonder a little bit if that's a bit of the chivalrousness.
one more time.
I wonder if that's a bit of the chivalrousness. Oh, dang. What's a better way to say that? I wonder if it's because he's being chivalry. Nope.
No, he's being chivalrous.
Chivalrous. Thank you. All right. One more time. I wonder if a little bit
That's
of
just Harry's nice guy attitude.
If it's Harry being chivalrous. Oh, for frack's sakes.
His chivalry, or he's being chivalrous.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. So if that's just Harry's gut instinct to want to help, that's what you're trying to say.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, that's what it's about.
That's pretty succinct.
And scene.
And scene. So he does eventually. He's like, okay, hang on, let's just get you in here and we'll discuss it in person, kind of a thing. And if I can help you, great. If not, I will, see about referring you to somewhere else. So she does agree to come in.
Ultimately speaking, he's a PI. Like, sure, he wants to more focus on the wizard aspect, but it's not exactly like a swindle. Like, More or less.
Yeah,
You're in
no.
the books as a PI and a wizard, so.
Yeah. More so under, yeah. Yeah, paranormal investigations, because that was something, because I was like, is he down as, and his business card is paranormal investigations. And so while, and I mean, it's kind of like, we used to know this hypnotist for a while. Do we plug? Hey, Mark Savard, hope you're still doing well. Awesome shows. But yeah, my sister and that kind of got into his shows, and I've been to a few. And that was one of his. He's like, there's not really, you can't learn how to be a hypnotist. The only thing really out there is like clinical hypnotism. So you can go and study under like therapists who do it for, therapeutic reasons and regression and things like that. And that's kind of where he learned some of the basics. And then he just kind of worked with it and adapted it more for the stage show fun parlor trick hypnosis of it rather than the clinical, right? So I think that's a little bit with Harry, right? He's like, well, again, not a lot of paranormal investigations, not a lot of wizard PIs out there. So he went and he did his straight up PI training under a licensed private investigator, right? Did what's the word I'm looking for? Not paid his dues, but did his time or whatever doing that. And then apprenticeship. But yeah, applies that to then just the spooky side of things.
Got his hours.
Yeah, got his hours. So yeah, he can do the straight up, but yeah.
All right. So once he's got that call, he makes arrangements with her to actually finally get her.
Yeah, so she's going to come by in like 45 minutes, an hour, whatever. And he's like, great, I got time to grab some lunch and get ready. And then the phone immediately rings again, and he's even more suspicious of it this time than initially, because apparently wizards and technology don't get on so well. He blows light bulbs all the time. The phones don't work properly. Anything after World War II is kind of his, for the modern day wizard. Any technology sort of fancier than that era of production is suspect.
Can I tell you, since I have been reading the Dresden Files, and because I work in IT, I have met many wizards. And
wait a minute.
My goodness, there are definitely people out there that electronics just do not work for. And it
that was my
matter
fair Jess.
what they do. Done.
You have one in the room.
Ah.
Yeah, we are.
Hi.
Dear.
She could kill our desktop at 50 paces. It did.
Don't tell me that.
Yeah.
I don't have insurance for this stuff yet.
It seems to have gotten slightly. I guess. Oh, Jess, I just realized we did not recognize and nurture your talent, and now
Squandered.
use it or lose it.
Thanks a lot.
You don't.
Now you're just bad with technology.
Wow. If only we had discovered these books earlier.
You ruined me.
But yeah, and I mean, I'm sure some of it was our older desktop, but yeah, me and my other daughter, not so much problem. My sister, not so much. Jessica, every time she went, like, we just about were like, do we wrap you in like the tinfoil hat? Or because every time she got here, it was like, bzz, and it would shut off. And
There are really people that are like
yeah,
that.
apparently, Grandpa, my dad, was. My mom used to always say, yeah, he'd zap watches.
Thanks a lot.
Wearing a rich wast, he could.
But it is explained later on in the books too that this technology thing is kind of only the magic interacts with the world in different ways. So in the current present, it's technology. Way back when wizards were curdle milk.
Manifested in different, and that's somewhere a little bit down the line. I forget exactly which one he describes that in.
So
But
you never know. Maybe future tech will eventually not bother a wizard so much. But okay,
It'll
it
be
also
holograms.
Said, sometimes it'd be like weird skin, like pock marks or warts.
yeah, how the traditional witch face of all being warty and scabby.
Phones
and
will be
stuff.
fine, but AI will just be very confused.
Maybe,
which is really better for everyone.
right.
But essentially, So again, so we've got this guy who's suspicious of magic,
Or technology.
Of technology, sorry, and he's gone from no cases to 2 phone calls.
Yeah, so he's
is
like,
suitably-
wait, what? But turns out legit. The second phone call is from Chicago PD, and it's Karen Murphy, and we get the gist that this is obviously not the first time, right? There's some background there. They know each other. She's calling him in on a case, and he's kind of giving her a bit of a hard time. It's like, oh, hey, Karen, how's it going? Good to hear from you. Oh, family's good. Yours? And she's like, yeah, cut the bullshit. This is, right? Because he's like, I haven't heard from you in a while, because this is where we learn that Harry makes the majority of his bread and butter, right? Like, he takes on private cases whenever possible, but again, right, he doesn't have a huge reputation and client base built up there, or word of mouth or anything. So for the most part, where he sort of steadily gets an income is getting called in to consult on police cases. And again, that's where he's, as you mentioned before, not down as a wizard, because that's still stretching it, but he's on the books as a psychic consultant. So that's how they kind of bend but yeah, basically, yeah. So then he's like, oh shit. She's like, yeah, not in the mood for my BS, my malarkey here. So yeah, so she's like, no, we got a bad one. Get over here. And he's like, well, I have an appointment. And she's like, I don't care, get over here. And he's like, okay, well, I do care. Like, but he's like, I'll tell you what, like, you're not very far. It is Midtown. He has an office in Midtown Chicago, but yeah, this hotel is a few blocks away. So he sort of compromises. He says, look, I'll come over, I'll check it out, and I'm going to make it back for my appointment. Right. And she's like, yeah, she's like, have you done lunch yet? And he's like, no, I was going to grab. Right. And she's like, yeah, don't. And he's like, oh, goody. So, that basically sums up that. So, yeah, we sort of meet Harry for the first time, and then he gets sort of these couple cases, and now we're off and running and seeing where this is going to lead to.
Which brings us to Chapter 2. This concludes our episode, Harry, You're a Wizard. Thank you for listening. You can check us out online at freeflowrambling.com or McAnally's.ca. There we have links to our other podcasts, social media, and other fun tidbits. Tune into our next episode for Chapter 2 and 3, Green Eyes and Broken Hearts. We are Free Flow Rambling. Conjure at it by your own risk.